entitled Talking Toleration. So, Alex.
Well, many thanks for those who've stayed the course in these lectures. It's been an immensely stimulating and rewarding experience for me, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to come here. And I want to say what an extraordinary institution the Wiles lectures are. In The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, first published in 1644, Roger Williams commented that the advocates of persecution and toleration prosecuted their cases in a marvellous different style and manner. While the arguments against persecution were advanced in milk, those in favour of it were usually made in blood. Williams saw a correlation between the tone and the substance of those who defended and rejected liberty of conscience. The former spoke kindly, gently, and meekly, the latter viciously and vehemently. Yet, as we've seen, rhetorical zeal was not the exclusive property of any particular party in the fractious and ongoing debates about religious pluralism unleashed by England's long Reformation. Protagonists on all sides of this multilateral conflict deployed words as weapons and recognised their power both to persuade and to antagonise, and to achieve as well as to undermine peace. The thrust of the lectures in this Wiles series has been to suggest that we should resist the tendency to see this as a paradox. The imperatives that drove attempts to tame the tongue, to tell the truth, and to exchange words reflect the fundamental ambivalence of speech and silence. Contemporaries understood charity and hatred, violence and love, not as opposites, but as points on a continuum, and indeed as twins. This fourth and final lecture develops these themes in further directions. It seeks to delineate social and cultural shifts that were reconfiguring what it meant to coexist with religious difference. It traces a series of discourses and practices that have frequently been linked with a diminution of confessional and sectarian tensions and the rise of toleration. These include those connected with charity, peace, civility, politeness, and conversation. It probes the premium that was increasingly placed on having a civil tongue, another phrase that has a double meaning. Although this lecture points to continuities with the earlier period, its centre of gravity lies in the later 17th and 18th centuries. In migrating into an era in which others have greater expertise than myself, I'm very conscious of my debts to these scholars, some of whom are in this room. This lecture is also, accordingly, more speculative than those that have preceded it. Its key contention is that we must pay close attention to the changing character as well as the content of verbal exchange. We must consider how people talked and talked about toleration. In recent years, there's been something of a seismic shift in the history of toleration. This has had three interconnected dimensions. First, a rich and venerable tradition of intellectual history has been supplemented by approaches drawn from social and cultural history. Alongside the study of attitudes and ideas, we're ever more attentive to the importance of behaviour and actions. A second element is an adjustment of perspective that accords as much, if not more, agency to ordinary people as to pioneering thinkers. Thirdly, narratives that stress linear development and trace a path of progress from persecution to toleration have been displaced by those that stress the contingency and limits of that process. My own previous work is implicated in these trends, not least in highlighting the dialectical interaction between tolerance and intolerance in this period. With others, I've stressed the resilience of the ideals of unity and reconciliation, and the extent to which arrangements that permitted coexistence were perceived as temporary expedients and imperfect solutions to the problem of pluralism. Surrounded by unease, toleration was compatible with distaste for and disapproval of the individuals and groups upon whom it was bestowed. the various forms of toleration that evolved were, to employ a recent coinage of Robert Hayden, forms of antagonistic tolerance. They remained varieties of what I've called charitable hatred. Yet while continuity must be acknowledged, it cannot be allowed to obscure signs of change. By the late 17th century, England was a society in which a growing number of people were coming to terms with the fact that Christian truth might be multi rather than univocal, and were saying so openly. According to the author of a pamphlet published in 1685, the majority now held the view that heaven is not entailed upon any particular opinion. The state's willingness to coerce the bodies and consciences of dissenters using physical violence was in decline. 1678 saw the formal abolition of the death penalty for heresy, though the 15th century statute prescribing it had already grown rusty in the scabbard. The royal indulgences of Charles II and James II were presented as magnanimous concessions to their dissenting subjects, albeit ones that reinforced their subordination and involved unequal power relations. The Act of Toleration of 1689 exempted Protestant nonconformists from other penal sanctions, including fines and imprisonment, while upholding them for Catholics and atheists. The effective abandonment of the official policy of uniformity created space for competing denominations. Once a pious obligation designed to bind the faithful together, fraternal correction became socially and culturally offensive to those who stood outside the established church. In a context in which adhering to a minority religion ceased to be life-threatening, the tactical silence of verbal dissimulation and casuistical equivocation could no longer be condoned as a short-term strategy for surviving persecution. Simultaneously, some, perhaps many, were coming to the view that honest and open expression of error might be better than hypocritical concealment of the truth. The sincerity, integrity, and intention of the believer was more important than the precise belief itself. Truth, in turn, was increasingly recognized as a relative category, encircled by a halo of spiritual doubt and epistemological uncertainty. The crisis of truth-telling that afflicted later Stuart England was a byproduct of the turbulence of the previous half-century, but it was also closely linked with developments in communicative practices, with the proliferation of printed and oral public debate, the lapse of censorship in the 1640s and again after 1695, and the development of a culture of partisanship. The effect, in the eyes of contemporaries, was to foster the spread of fiction, lying, and falsehood. At its heart, as Mark Knights has suggested, this was a crisis about the effects of language and speech. Taking a leaf out of Knight's book, here I consider the nexus between linguistic strategies and the religious and political realities that they not only mirrored but also constructed. I focus less on the novelty of ideas than on changes in the way in which they were discussed. This lecture floats a further hypothesis. Might the advent of licensed pluralism have made the erection of other kinds of boundaries, including linguistic ones, more imperative? Did language acquire greater significance as a tool for religious differentiation and as a marker of faith and piety in everyday life? As we've seen, the Christian concept of caritas was a powerful thread in early modern thinking about the connections between faith and community. Underpinning the Augustinian tradition of compassionate coercion, it provided a mandate for the use of verbal and physical force as a means of reclaiming sinners. The wholesome severity of imprisonment, corporal punishment, and fines was justified as a means of healing the breaches in the body politic and restoring it to health. Good Samaritans were people who restrained their brethren and neighbours from straying, told them the truth, and lovingly administered friendly admonition and fraternal rebuke. On the other hand, charity was a vital strand in ideals and practices surrounding neighbourhood. Contemporaries understood it as a key social cement. The duty of love that Christians owed to fellow members of humanity included the responsibility to strive to resolve conflict, appease enmities, and seek harmony. It was a model for the forms of agreement by which medieval cities endeavoured to achieve concord in the face of frictions associated with diversity. Together with the virtue of patience, it underpinned the notion of tolerantia, with its connotations of enduring irritation, pain, and suffering. It was to tolerate a situation that was far from ideal. As Chris Marsh argued in Popular Religion in 16th century England, and has more recently been reiterated by Andy Wood in Faith, Hope and Charity, the doctrine of Christian neighbourhood carried within it an instinct to hold one's peace. In this age of turmoil, we should think less of cosy parochial tranquility than of an aspiration to suspend judgment and live together in relative peace. Throughout the period, it resulted in practical forms of tolerance on the ground. We catch glimpses of it in Henrician London among citizens reluctant to turn in evangelicals for fear of being regarded in the sight of all as guilty of treachery against their neighbours, and in the guise of Walter Staplehood, the Catholic mayor of Exeter, who behaved kindly towards his Protestant neighbours in 1556, and did, both friendly and lovingly, bear with them and wink at them. We see this shy creature in the many instances in which Elizabethan members of the Church of England intervened to protect recusants who lived in proximity to them, and turned a blind eye and deaf ear to visits from missionary priests, as well as in the quiet acceptance of the familists by Orthodox inhabitants of the Cambridgeshire village of Walsham, near where I now live. We see it in Haddenham in Buckinghamshire in October 1670, when a poor man by the name of John Bishop refused to break down the door of the Quaker John Adams in order to distrain his goods, with tears trickling down his cheeks, saying he was loath to wrong his peaceable neighbours. Ties of deference, employment, acquaintance and kinship were additional ingredients in local initiatives that only rarely and indirectly leave a mark on the historical record. This is because they often took the form of a decision to refrain from speaking in ways that would aggravate other people, if not to remain completely silent. These acts of omission were also acts of communication and speech. They're even more invisible within the family and household, where they shade into another sentiment, kindness, welding together goodwill, material aid and courtesy, and combining ethics with affect. As Linda Pollock has shown, this cluster concept was closely linked with charity, hospitality, civility and politeness. Its linguistic and emotional register was gradually shifting against the backdrop of religious, political, social and cultural change. Norman Jones has written wisely of the private treaties of internal toleration that allowed the bonds of love and duty to paper over the chasms of ideology. We may compare these informal and ad hoc arrangements with the friendship pacts into which people in provincial towns in France entered during the wars of religion. Olivier Christin situates these promises to live in perpetual peace and fraternity in a longer tradition of mechanisms for building the solidarity of inhabitants and repairing ruptured social bonds. They were a kind of collective oath to uphold reciprocal obligations despite the tears in the fabric wrought by religious diversity and sectarian conflict. Some of these oral accords were sealed with a handshake or exchange of pledges and recorded in writing. More than a few involved a commitment to moderating the tone of discourses delivered from the pulpit. A modus vivendi between warring confessions, they deployed a language of pacts that attests the resilience of John Bossey's moral tradition, as well as to the agency of ordinary citizens in seeking compromise and reconciliation. The impulse for charity and peace, to which these experiments attest, was both severely tested and reinvigorated by the Reformations. Local friendship pacts foreshadow the official edicts of pacification and oblivion, by which societies across Europe sought to suppress tension, heal wounds, end war, and bring about peace. The Peace of Augsburg, the Pacification of Ghent, the Edict of Nantes, and the Peace of Westphalia were all predicated on assumptions about the efficacy of burying the memory of past violence in silence and restraining intemperate speech. They explicitly ordered people to smother recent traumatic events in silence and to refrain from oral invective. They gave expression to the belief that abstaining from discussing contentious subjects was sometimes necessary for the sake of social and political stability. Fusing forgiveness with forgetting, these two strategies were interlinked with a concession of toleration. In the English context, this is best demonstrated by the Declaration of Breda and the Act of Oblivion of 1660, though it also had precedents during the Cromwellian interregnum. The Declaration of Breda promised liberty of conscience, acknowledging that the passion and uncharitableness of the times have produced several opinions in religion, by which men are engaged in parties and animosities against each other, which, when they shall hereafter unite in a freedom of conversation, will be composed and better understood. The second, the Act of Oblivion, sought to bury all seeds of future discords and remembrance of the former troubles, wars and discords that had fractured Charles I's three kingdoms for 2 decades, including clauses that prohibited the utterance of words tending to revive remembrance of what it euphemistically called the late differences or the occasions thereof, on pain of a sliding scale of fines. Parliament endorsed the Act of Oblivion, but refused to legislate for toleration, instead renewing the persecution of Puritan dissent in revenge for its role in fomenting the Great Rebellion. The peace for which so many strove was double-edged. Indeed, as Phil Withington has shown, the term was politicised in the period in ways that legitimised violence and justified militancy. Like the concept of moderation studied by Ethan Shagan, it presupposed the exercise of force to maintain political order. The semantic connotations it acquired are indicative of wider transformations in church, state, and society, and the vocabularies by which relationships between them were described. One straw in the wind is the Anglican clergyman Joseph Glanville's sermon on Catholic charity, delivered before the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of London in 1669, the aim of which was the abating of animosities among Christians occasioned by differences in religion. Stressing the dangers of odious names, indiscreet words, and the persecution of the tongue, it called upon contemporaries to avoid angry disputes and study moderate and pacific ways. Elsewhere, Glanville urged rigid enforcement of the laws against Protestant nonconformists and condemned toleration of their practices. But he also believed that belief should not be coerced and advocated the accommodation of differences of opinion within the Church of England. In this sermon, he saw the adoption of new modes of verbal expression as a remedy for the bitter religious divisions of his own era. A second piece of evidence is the Sussex minister William Ashton's A Seasonable Discourse Against Toleration. Published in 1685, this was a defence of religious coercion addressed to his dissenting brethren, who he claimed were not persecuted as saints, but punished as malefactors. To endeavour to moderate and assuage conflicts was a work Christian and charitable, he said, even if it proved fruitless and unsuccessful in the end. Begging the patience and charity of his opponents, he refrained from harsh invectives against them, insisting that they were not molested in conscience unless they laboured to infect others with their grace-destroying opinions. He added that the charge of oppression could be turned on their own heads, they being not innocent sufferers but injurious aggressors, guilty of the persecution of the tongue via the bitter taunts, rude sarcasms, unmannerly jeers, fabulous stories, and scandalous reproaches by which they vexed righteous souls. Ashton was the son of a clergyman ejected in 1662, and the mixture of forbearance and irritation that marks his rhetoric may reflect his own filial experience. This was a form of generational rebellion. Those who became proponents of toleration were also deeply concerned about the capacity of corrosive language to erode the bond of mutual charity and trust. In John Locke's mature thinking, as Teresa Bejan has so persuasively shown, persecution was not a loving chastisement, but a counterproductive device that created hypocrisy. But the granting of liberty of worship did not give free rein in the sphere of speech, not least because Locke envisaged language as the common tie of society and its misuse as antagonistic to its durability. The concomitant of this was the need for greater civility in the realm of interpersonal practice, which was the key to achieving the old Christian ideal of concordia. Toleration, he argued, would create the conditions for courteous disagreement about religious difference. This was not only necessary for social peace, it also laid the foundations for Irenic reunion. For Locke, the opposite arguings of men of parts were, in Bejan's words, an engine of truth production. Similar concerns prompted a 1705 tract advocating moderation entitled The Balance. Its author called upon the clergy of the Church of England to promote love, not hate, not feuds, not factions, and to set aside hard words, jealousies, and fears. He described an environment in which people on all sides heard in conversation the noise and violent disputes of rivals, who stigmatized them using opprobrious nicknames, including Whig, fanatic, and Republican. He urged that we admit no heat against our neighbour for differing with us in opinion or principles of religion, for there can be no heat without passion, and all that is passionate is irrational as well as unchristian. We ought not to be violent against our neighbours for not believing as we do, because it is no means of conviction of a free, rational creature. It is impossible to force the mind by violence. This quotation not only reflects the manner in which toleration came to occupy the ground of moderation, it's also suggestive of the elusive connection between the arguments that justified it and the temper and temperature of oral encounters. A further consequence of the reorientation of rhetorical and religious priorities was a reassessment of styles of preaching, the eclipse in some quarters of lacerating sermons that lanced the boil of sin to more compassionate discourses that stressed divine mercy. The sharp tongue-lashing that many Elizabethan and early Stuart divines regarded it as their duty to inflict upon their parishioners was displaced by an emphasis on redeeming sinners in more conciliatory ways. This was another phase in an ongoing cycle in which studied moderation as an evangelical strategy seeks to correct the perceived excesses of ardent zeal. In the early 17th century, some Puritan ministers had already suggested that fraternally reproving the reprobate was wasted effort. The separatist identity of dissenting Protestantism was reinforced by the Toleration Act, which acknowledged its presence but placed it outside the pale of the established church. This surely strengthened the sense of spiritual kinship and fellow feeling that held the godly together. Abraham van Engen's discerning analysis of this theology of sympathy highlights its double valence as an instrument of both inclusion and exclusion, of a reciprocal affection with one's brethren that went hand in hand with dissociation from the visibly reprobate. The boundaries of this community of belonging narrowed after the legislation of 1689. Like compassion, sympathy had limits and indeed a sharp edge. As a technology that governs social relations, it erected barriers as well as generated ties of affinity. It too illustrates the ambivalence of early modern tolerance. Civility is another concept that hovers between a textual invocation and a lived practice. We've already seen how this word was rising in use and importance. Derived from the Latin civilitas, it had roots in civic humanism and was a manifestation of the qualities of good citizenship and government. But its status as a courtly ideal should not obscure its connections with spiritual discipline and piety. Control of the body, including the tongue, was associated with the reformation of the soul. Civility had a complex array of meanings in the 16th and 17th centuries, but eloquent and orderly speech and physical deportment were both central to it. Civility marked the difference between the decorous language of the educated elite and the unrefined chatter and gabble of their lowlier inferiors. It also distinguished the speech of civilized Europeans from that of the savage and barbarous people they encountered in the New World. The Babel of linguistic diversity bore the imprint of uneven stages of human development. Sometimes the obligation to show civility to persons of rank clashed with the fact that they were unbelievers. Proclamations in 1621 and 1624 sought to restrain the insolencies of rude and savage barbarism which were daily committed in the streets against foreign ambassadors and other strangers. Proceeding from the wicked and devilish humour of base people, these affronts included forms of gesture and countenance, as well as insulting words, and they were condemned as unfit to grace persons of civil behaviour. But speech habits deemed to fall short of courtesy also became the target of sectarian polemic, as conservative discourse against the levelling language and plain speaking of the Quakers reveals. An English translation of the Frenchman Antoine de Courtin's treatise on the rules of civility, published in 1678, defined it as a science that teaches us to dispose our words and actions in their proper and just places. Its hallmarks were decorum and modesty. Some contemporaries shared the view that uncivil speech and conduct should be restrained in the interests of order, including Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan began with an account of the power of language and its abuse. The civil silence that he advocated was a mechanism for containing the disruptive potential of verbal communication, especially when it took the form of belligerent proselytism. This silence could not restore consensus or harmony, but it would stifle vocal contention and overt disorder. Teresa Bejan contrasts this with the principle of mere civility that lies at the heart of Roger Williams' The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. For Williams, civility denoted a low bar of courteous behaviour towards others that was compatible with disrespect and even disgust for their religious convictions. It was a necessary and sufficient condition for a toleration that did not involve conceding the truth of competing faiths and was in keeping with active evangelism, the end product of which might be to eliminate them. A way of navigating the competing imperatives of inclusion and exclusion, mere civility was not the same as the Christian love one should show to one's spiritual brethren. By 1700, these two classes of people were no longer inseparable. Church and society had ceased to be coterminous. Civility is inextricably linked with conversation and politeness. Both are closely connected with the putative emergence of a Habermasian public sphere and with Norbert Elias's influential thesis regarding the civilizing process, on neither of which I intend to dilate here. They occupy a key place in the dominant narratives of secularization that still shape our understanding of the 18th century. Recent work by Sarah Petrie, Robert Ingram, Ralph Stevens, and Caris Brown urges us to see it less through a telescope looking forward to later modernity than retrospectively through the lens of England's long Reformation. Here I follow their lead. As an idea and a practice, conversation, like civility, had classical antecedents, as was reanimated during the Renaissance. Ciceronian notions of its significance for political participation were transmuted by humanists who saw it as an instrument for the production of knowledge and the cultivation of virtue. The many manuals teaching genteel and courtly elites the art of urbane, witty, and agreeable conversations that appeared indicate the growing fashionability of this skill. The flow of translations from European vernaculars, including the Italian Stefano Guazzo's Civil Conversation, which appeared in English in 1586 and contained guidance on conversing with familiars and strangers, both within and out of doors. Others arrived from France. The Art of Complaisance of 1673 described how to regulate our words and behaviour in such a manner as may engage the love and respect of those with whom we converse. It also had sections on reservation and dissimulation as a mode of evading the malice and contrivances of men, and advice on prudent silence on subjects that might prejudice friends and frustrate one's own designs. More famous is Jonathan Swift's treatise on polite conversation, printed in 1738, but dating from the 1690s, when he spent much of his time in the company of polite people whose choicest expressions he recorded in a pocketbook. Although its proximity to idle gossip was a source of anxiety, conversation was widely envisaged as an agent of social and moral edification. For the female philosopher Damaris Masham, without such commerce, people would grow wild. The metaphors employed in a passage in one of the best-known pedagogic texts on this topic, the Congregational Minister Isaac Watts's Improvement of the Mind, are particularly striking. He wrote, "Often has it happened in free discourse that new thoughts are strangely struck out, and seeds of truth sparkle and blaze through the company, which in calm and silent reading would never have been excited. By conversation you will both give and receive this benefit, as flints when put into motion and striking against each other produce lively fire on both sides, which would never have arisen from the same hard materials in a state of rest." Watts' notion of conversation as a catalyst to reaching a higher plane of understanding is reminiscent of the way in which earlier generations had conceived of religious disputation. Truth was no longer a singular entity, and its locus was now the conscience, but open-ended discursive exchange remained a vital stimulus to its attainment. Conversation calls out into light what has been lodged in all the recesses and secret chambers of the soul. Watts' comments are also suggestive of the legacy that a key argument for religious liberty bequeathed to the 18th century. Conversation took place in a range of venues and forums. Coffee houses, clubs, assemblies, and voluntary associations were key sites of civility and sociability, but so were the landscape and the domestic realm of the home. These settings feature in the many conversation pieces painted by artists in this period. In each location, the tongue was lubricated by new habits and practices, including the drinking of exotic beverages and the consumption of other intoxicants. The line between public and private was porous, but conversation had to be carefully calibrated for its audience. Danger lurked within the interstitial space between silence and talking, because sound could travel, rumours could fly, and walls could hear. Whether conducted in a coffee house or an inn, on the road or in a parlour, everyday talk entailed decisions about what to say and what to omit. Two snapshots offer insight into how this impacted upon interconfessional relations. Daniel Defoe's pen portrait of the Anglican and nonconformist clergy of Dorchester taking tea together in 1724 describes them conversing with civility and good neighbourhood, like men of a Catholic and extensive charity. 2 years earlier, when Philip Doddridge took a stagecoach from London to Leicester, he found himself in company as good as I could have expected. There was indeed one violent Tory, but when he knew that I was a dissenter, he had the good manners to drop the discourse. Courtesy required a suspension of linguistic hostilities, if only superficially. Defoe's travel narrative and Doddridge's letter to his sister were themselves shaped by emerging social conventions. Like the episodes they recounted, these texts testify to changing protocols regarding speech. In The Government of the Tongue, Richard Alistry urged his contemporaries to demonstrate the evangelical precept of loving our neighbours as ourselves and to display true charity in their speech. The epidemic of defamatory language he detected in Restoration society was so extensive that even religion, at least those parties and factions which assume that name, has got the taint of it, each sect or opinion seeking to represent its antagonist as odious as it can. He wished that people would set aside mutual calumnies as weapons of spiritual warfare and express themselves with greater civility. This was surely a more effective way of exercising the duty of vigilance over the souls of fellow Christians than bitter invectives and backbiting that inflicted verbal injuries. Privileging good humour and frowning upon overt expressions of bigotry, elegant conversations came to be seen as a salve for the wounds opened up by religious and political conflict, as well as an antidote to enthusiasm. Their critical ingredient was politeness, a creed which Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, and the Whig periodicals sponsored by Richard Steele and Joseph Addison, The Tatler and The Spectator, contributed to constructing. If politeness was a sign of gentility and breeding, it was also explicitly envisaged as a mode of de-escalating sectarian enmities. Addison was eager to extinguish the pernicious spirit of passion and prejudice that characterized the rage of party. Polite language promised to dampen the inflammatory partisan discourse that had torn the nation apart, but it was itself a tool for demarcating the parameters of linguistic acceptability. Mark Knights reminds us that it was not politically neutral and could be a device for denying legitimacy to a rival point of view. In turn, the forms of dissimulation that smoothed the surface of polite conversation exposed it to charges of hypocrisy, a word that derives from the Greek for playing a part. Proponents of the art of rhetoric had long recognized that mendacity was an integral part of speech-making and that oratory was a performance in which the speaker adopted a particular voice. The petty falsehoods people uttered in the interests of civility explain why some Protestants saw polite discourse as a form of dishonesty and artifice. Misrepresentation was at once the evil that politeness was supposed to solve and a product of it. The old Ciceronian adage that one was better served by bitter-tongued enemies than sweet-smelling friends was often repeated. As the opposite of flattery, the spirit of fraternal correction lived on. Politeness has frequently been seen as a resolutely secular discourse, but it also functioned as a religious idiom. The emergence of new rules for civility did not occur in isolation from the church and piety. Occasional and contradictory, politeness could also be a kind of negative sociability. Ostensibly conciliatory speech could create the conditions in which distrust and resentment lingered. Beneath the polished surface of many conversations lay a degree of disapproval. Caris Brown has recently shown how these practices served as an instrument of the tacit exclusion of Protestant dissenters in the 18th century. The subtle social ostracism they facilitated may have lacked the sharp edge of state coercion, but it was still, in her words, a form of persecution by politeness. Steering a course between the desire to integrate themselves into respectable society and upholding their separate identity could open them up to the charge of hypocrisy, confirming inherited anti-Puritan stereotypes at the same time as eroding their distinctiveness from the conforming majority. In tandem with ongoing efforts to restrict, if not reverse, the toleration extended to nonconformists, this had the effect of reproducing the experience of social discrimination that had previously defined them. Walking this tightrope also caused moral discomfort. Reconfigured for the new conversible world of the 18th century, the casuistries of quotidian interaction I discussed in Lecture 2 continued to prickle the consciences of the devout. As the pages of her diary attest, Anne Dawson, the daughter of a Lancashire Presbyterian minister, simultaneously felt the pull of agreeable conversation and sensed its capacity to lead her into spiritual laxity and sin. Similarly, the apparently benign guises in which anti-popery cloaked itself in the writings of Addison and others cannot hide the ingrained antipathies hidden within them. Politer forms of expression leached out some of the venom of earlier polemic, but the priority of debunking Catholicism, protecting people from seduction, and buttressing Protestant patriotism remained. Indeed, to extend an observation made by Anthony Milton, the many practical accommodations that people made with papists in daily life actually demanded that they attack their religion stridently on the level of theory. If this helped to mitigate the ethical unease created by confessional coexistence, it also served to reaffirm prejudices. The absorption of anti-popery into the very culture of sociability and material consumption might be seen in the same light. Fireplace tiles, playing cards, crockery, and ceramic trays designed for the popular game of Pope Joan quite literally became conversation pieces that reinforced partisan feelings. They poked fun at Catholicism in ways that at once diffused tension but also reinforced its status as an alien other. The homes in which such objects were kept were places where papists and Protestants mixed, sharing meals and seasonal festivities, celebrating rites of passage, attending parties, and swapping gossip. Adverse reflections on the adherents of other religions still abounded, but they were often clothed in the mantle of satire and wit. Humour and laughter had always been weapons for puncturing pride and pretension, exposing vice and reforming error, but they assumed new forms during the Enlightenment. Satirical discourses could be highly acidic. As the editors of The Spectator commented in 1713, the most polite age is in danger of being the most vicious. Ross Carroll's recent study of ridicule in this period reveals how it continued to be used to deliver moral and religious criticism. For the Earl of Shaftesbury, it was a vital means of undermining both the fanatical enthusiasm of the French millenarian prophets who arrived in London in 1706 and the hatred stirred by the notorious sermon against toleration preached by the High Churchman Henry Sacheverell 3 years later. What prevents the man of mirth from telling the truth, ran the epitaph, borrowed from Horace's satires to Shaftesbury's letter on this topic, printed in 1708. It was a type of shock therapy designed to shame its targets and to prompt people to reflect on their own folly and to reassess the basis of their beliefs. It bore the stamp of the cordial coexistence that it was intended to support. Carroll calls it a tolerant alternative to persecution. It demonstrated a continuing commitment to engaging in dialogue with the religiously misguided that contrasts with the silence of mutual disdain. Did the licensing of Protestant dissent in 1689 have the effect of making markers such as speech more rather than less important in articulating religious difference? How one spoke and when one chose to remain silent may have acquired added significance when physical suffering and legal penalties became a thing of the past. In their absence, verbal and gestural mannerisms served as a shibboleth that set the godly apart from the rest. This is the substance of a passage in a mocking pamphlet commenting on the passage of the Profane Oaths Act in 1745, which jestingly reflects that members of the Church of England are distinguished from Protestant dissenters by nothing more than by the constant custom of interlarding all conversation with swearing, cursing, and blaspheming, a custom to which the dissenters are generally very backward to conform. And this, as is supposed by all charitable Christians who are not dissenters, merely and for no other reason but because the church folks do so. Grating in the ears of voluntary Anglicans, these communicative habits help to reproduce the feeling of marginalisation and exclusion that had proved so empowering before 1689. For the heirs of the Calvinist tradition, delineated by Patrick Collinson in a classic essay entitled The Cohabitation of the Faithful with the Unfaithful, some degree of martyrdom, if not the stake, then death by the 1,000 cuts of civil ostracism, was a necessity. The strange cadences and gravity of Quaker speech likewise continued to differentiate them after real suffering had ceased. They served as an enduring symbolic resource to which the Friends resorted in times of transition and stress. On the other side, they helped to entrench perceptions of denominational difference in English society. Sharp exchanges of words did not disappear in 18th century England, despite the emphasis on civility and politeness that pervades contemporary commentary. Both within and beyond the circles of the elite, tempers still flared and tongues still blazed. Cases of words spoken in derogation of peers, raised under the law of scandalum magnatum, likewise dropped off. The resurgence of suits for this crime of derogatory speech after 1660 was an attempt to reassert aristocratic privilege following the interregnum. But having recovered their wealth and influence, fewer peers were inclined to pursue such actions in the 18th century. This legal device was also tainted by its association with those who supported the discredited Stuarts. In 1684, the Duke of York himself had prosecuted Titus Oates for saying that he was a rascal, a papist and a traitor, and that he hoped to see him hanged. Cases of slander and defamation took a downward turn in this period. Bob Shoemaker has traced the decline of public insult and the diminishing tendency for people to resort to the church courts to defend their honour. And Peter Rushton has found a comparably sharp decrease in prosecutions for seditious words in local courts after 1700. They see this as partly a product of the atomisation and anonymisation of community in an age of urbanisation and the collapse of press censorship, which enabled aggression to find an outlet in print. But it also indexes changing behaviour, especially new assumptions about civility. One consequence of this was that acrimonious exchanges moved from the doorstep and marketplace to inside the home. Women, in particular, were less willing to air their dirty linen in open court, the substance of the abuse hurled at them being perceived as indelicate and indecent. Men, particularly of inferior rank, were more frequently the plaintiffs in instance cases, and there was a corresponding shift of focus from offences of the mouth to those of the body and hand, from unruly speech to physical violence. It's important to acknowledge that defamation was always a matter of interpretation. Decisions about whether to take action depended on how seriously the victim and witness took what was said. The manner in which the words in question were delivered had always been critical to its definition. The words had to be spoken in an angry, passionate, and malicious way for the charge to stick and have credibility. This reflected the continuing idea that slander was a breach of Christian charity. As Faybound Alberti observes, the repetition of these and similar formula in depositions suggests more was involved in these narratives than the transparently reflected speech of litigants. Allegations of statements made in wrath, fury, and heat may tell us less about the emotional mood of the defamer than about legal and social conventions that were themselves in a state of flux. The shrinking number of cases that reach the courts is nevertheless indicative of changes in both the practice and perception of verbal communication. Words spoken in a bantering way or in a passing moment of passion might be forgiven. In 1795, an attorney at the Sussex Assizes thought that this was one reason why actions for words had generally fallen into disrepute. It's tempting to see this as evidence that questions of honour and reputation were gradually moving out of the orbit of the moral domain of the law, and to suggest that this signals the demise of communal regulation of the sins of the tongue. Public penance as a means of shaming sinners and fostering reconciliation was gradually drifting out of use in England and in Scotland too. However, the extent and speed of this transition should not be overstated. Shifts in sensibility were encouraging people to find different ways of resolving conflict and settling interpersonal disputes. The death of neighbourhood has perhaps been exaggerated, but there remained plenty of room for rancorous disagreement, as the robust exchange depicted in this cartoon in a satirical tract about women's clubs reveals. "Come out, you bitch, I'll maul you. Kiss my arse, you whore, I'll nab your cuckold." A great deal of this conversation was not explicitly about religion, but it was implicitly coloured by the multi-confessionalism that permeated English society. And at moments of political crisis, speech could still disturb the peace and spark violence. The crowds that participated in the Sacheverell riots and the outbreaks of disorder provoked by the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745 gave expression to their anxieties in heated and intemperate words, which spilled over into physical attacks on the symbols and property, though rarely the persons, of Presbyterians and Catholics. They chanted morale-boosting rallying cries such as High Church and Sacheverell, and mocking taunts and rhymes, denigrating Rome and the Papists. Effigies of the Pope were paraded through the streets to be burnt, accompanied by music and loud acclamations. Writing about the momentous weeks preceding the Glorious Revolution, Daniel Defoe recalled how rumour transformed the wild threats issued by James II's retreating Irish troops to set fire to towns and kill men, women and children into reports that they'd already carried out these awful deeds and would do so again in every settlement they passed through. "Fear gave wings to the news," wrote Defoe, in a passage that neatly illustrates the perceived potential for speech to lead directly to action. By contrast, when the Catholic and Jacobite Charles Farrell declared in June 1756 that King George II was a thief and said that he'd shoot his present majesty on the throne and that he'd destroy them all, the authorities concluded that this was just a lot of hot air. Farrell was in a pub at the time and he was seriously drunk. He was confined in Newgate, but only until he could find sureties for his good behaviour. There were still those who felt impelled to speak what they believed to be the truth, regardless of the consequences. The aggressive proselytizing phase of the Quaker movement had passed by 1700, but some felt impelled to protest vocally against the evils of their age. Benjamin Lay, sometime glovemaker, sailor, and draper, was disowned by several groups of friends as a troublemaker. A man of small stature who had a congenital growth disorder, he made bold testimonies against tea and tobacco. And after he moved to Philadelphia, he carried a set of expensive china to the marketplace and destroyed it in public view. On the 19th of September 1738, he entered a Quaker meeting house in Burlington, New Jersey, and breaking the silence, declared in a loud voice that slavery was the greatest sin of all. Throwing off his coat, he thrust his sword into an animal bladder of red juice hidden inside the covers of a Bible, saying, "Thus shall God shed the blood of those persons who enslaved their fellow creatures." He warned the horrified congregation that vengeance would befall those who did not reform. Lay's theatrical exploits were not to the taste of the current generation of Friends, but his campaign did help to effect a shift in opinion within the society against keeping slaves. In 1667, Richard Alistry lamented that the government of the tongue now seemed to be an art wholly outdated. The moralistic treatises on taming this unruly member, published in such numbers in the earlier era, declined in vogue. But there was one sin of speaking that remained an affront to what was still a self-consciously Christian society: blasphemy. Some conservatives blamed the rising tide of atheism and profaneness on toleration itself. After the 1687 Declaration of Indulgence, a Berkshire gentleman worried that the irreligion of the heathenish common people will be intolerable, so that they'll differ from beasts only in speech and not in sense and understanding. At one level, this was simply an extension of a long-standing trope. William Gearing's concern in 1663 that in common talk God is quite forgotten as a man dead out of mind echoes the sentiments of Elizabethan Puritan ministers like George Gifford and Arthur Dent. On another, it reflected the presence of people whose brazen unbelief appalled even those whose piety was merely skin deep. Among them was the Edinburgh University student Thomas Aikenhead. His articulate rejection of Trinitarian theology and scoffing contempt for the Old Testament as a confection of fables led to his execution in Edinburgh in 1697. The impudence with which atheists audibly assaulted Christian orthodoxy incensed their contemporaries, convincing them that free thinking and libertinism were more widespread than they may in fact have been. The story that circulated about an apothecary called John Eliot, who was hung for the same crime in the same city 3 years earlier, reflects the continuing vitality of both a tradition of contrite public apology and the idea that the Almighty would providentially punish those who transgressed with their tongues. It was said that his confession had to be read because he could not speak it, his mouth being no bigger than the bowl of a tobacco pipe head, which he said had been contracted by a judgment of God for ridiculing the Scriptures. Many worried that witty and irreverent jests in alehouses and coffeehouses would lead them to reject religion per se. Sociability and civility could lead to incredulity. It's no accident that a preoccupation with swearing, cursing, blaspheming, and profaning featured prominently in the renewed drive to stamp out immorality and to reform manners that marked these decades. The Blasphemy Act of 1598 reflected the same priorities, as well as the view that civil peace required the restraint of public expression of untruth. Heresy was no longer a capital offence, but the state still took seriously its responsibility to police this ultimate sin of the tongue. As I reach the end of this series of lectures, I'm conscious of conforming to revisionist type and demonstrating what some might see as the Achilles heel of my work, an emphasis on continuity over change, and an allergy to teleology and narratives of progress. The balance of my analysis here has probably tipped towards emphasizing the destructive powers of speech and its ongoing capacity to foster intolerance and to facilitate exclusion. I've highlighted the inherent ambiguity of a series of discourses and practices that seem to promise the opposite: charity, compassion, civility, peace, and politeness. I've shied away from paradigms of linear development in favour of stressing oscillations and cycles, and recognising the complex social and political dynamics that shaped the ever-shifting relationship between words and actions. I know I need to think more about the conundrum of when and why one led to another. At the risk of dwelling on the darker side of the Enlightenment, I'm drawn to the conclusion that the tradition of charitable hatred was not extinguished, but rather transmuted. This may partly be a side effect of the times in which we live. Anxiety about the damage done by derogatory and violent words is pervasive in our society too. Now we restrain speech not to protect religious truth, but the sensitivities of individual believers. We struggle to reconcile our own version of freedom of speech with demands to control the tongues of those who offend others and incite riot. News headlines reveal these tensions in multiple spheres, from the reaction to the Scottish hate speech law to responses to campus protests against the Gaza-Israel war, from calls to regulate the raging voices that cause harm on social media to acts of political protest of the most provocative kind. After last week's shooting of the Slovakian Prime Minister, its president deplored the capacity of hateful rhetoric to lead to hateful action, saying that democracy needs arguments, not assassinations. I've left the resonance of my subject to speak for itself, and as a historian, I do not presume to make prescriptions for the future. My instinctive pessimism may also be a product of the biases of the early modern archive. The historical record is skewed towards recording hostility and violence. It elides the compromises and casuistries that permitted coexistence, because this was a culture in which these were a source of ethical disquiet. It is stacked in favour of persecution and against toleration. The silence in which much social tolerance is shrouded is notoriously hard to interpret. Does it signal consent or indifference, an active willingness to live with difference, or a passive endurance of what cannot be eliminated? Drowned out by noisier and angrier voices, people who refrain from speaking do not pluck at our sleeves. There is an inbuilt danger of overlooking those who disdained polemical labels and polarised debate in favour of quiet irenicism. A recent study calls these people Christians without names. To understand the meaning of the varieties of religious speech and silence I've explored in these lectures, it is necessary to listen to tone as well as to decode content. In short, it is necessary to develop a period ear. Both speech and silence played a role in provoking conflict and division, but this must be balanced by appreciation of their capacity to assist people to lessen friction and to come to terms with religious diversity. The language of the body and the sound of the tongue helped to establish the conditions in which contemporaries learnt to live with those who adhered to other faiths and found ways to disagree more amicably. When people choose to speak, and what they leave unsaid can build bridges, create trust, and alleviate tensions. It can lower the temperature of social relations, at least for a time. Talking can be a route to toleration. Goethe famously wrote that to tolerate is to insult, but it is also to forgive and forget, and it can form the basis for stability and peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. We just want to finish by saying a few words of thanks to people who've made this lecture series possible. First of all, working behind the scenes constantly and making everything happen very efficiently, Nicola Hook, who's our administrator in HAP and who has been supporting the Wiles lectures over the last couple of years, does an immense amount of work. We're very grateful to our external academic trustees, to David Armitage of Harvard and Lyndall Roper of Oxford, who help guide us in the selection and the decisions we have to make about the Wiles lectures. Also to our family trustees, Peter Boyd and Anthony Boyd. No, Peter is here today. And to the Boyd family, much more widely, many of whom were present last night with the opportunity to spend time with them. The continuing support of the family over many decades now is very much appreciated. I'd like to thank also our academic guests who have given up their time to come and to share their expertise with us over the last 4 days. To Adam Morton, Judith Pullman, Tom Hamilton, and Caris Brown, thank you very much for coming here this week. But finally, of course, and most importantly, to our Wiles lecturer for 2024, Alex Walsham, who's given us 4 lectures which have done so much to expand and to enhance our understanding of these complex relationships between speaking and silence, between confrontation and toleration, not just as these relate to the greats and to the highly educated in society who operate through print culture, but also in relation to those ordinary people interacting in the streets, the alehouses, and the courts of early modern England. It's been a real privilege to hear these lectures over the last 4 days. I have learnt a lot from them. I'm sure everyone in the room has learnt immensely from them. We look forward to them appearing in print in due course. But can we finish by thanking Alex for such a wonderful series of Wiles lectures in 2024?